I welcome people to go, and especially people who are new to the game, who are curious about the kinds of things that landlording is all about, because sometimes we have this misconception that the whole thing is this passive endeavor where we go in and we plant our flag and then we just sit back and the money just rolls right in. All right, well, it's not exactly that. You know, I get a lot of feedback online.
That's exactly what we teach her. So.
No, it's not.
Think about the amount of risk that these people assume. Think about the responsibility they take to maintain a habitable place for that working class guy to live. That when things go wrong, they go and fix it. When things need improvement, investors go and improve them. 1/3 of all places where people reside in the United States are rentals. And today we're going to talk about the kinds of importances that you guys have and the things that you should consider important as you're entering into this game. The truth of your role is that you typically step in and operate using somebody else's stuff. You didn't build the property. You probably didn't get the set of tenants that are there when you acquire it. But you are now responsible for that property. And one of the things that happens when you get other people's property that now becomes yours is you got to know what you have in hand. And so part of what you learn here is you got to evaluate the property as it is and then come up with a plan for making it better. Because there are hidden problems where you might need a landlord attorney when you come upon new property. For example, you might buy property that has defects that affect the health or safety of an ordinary tenant. And in the state of Texas, that can spell trouble for you as the owner if you don't respond with diligence. Because tenants have certain rights. One of those rights is the right to rescind the contract. To just say, you know what, I've given you adequate notice and you landlord, you investor have not responded. You have not cured this defect. I'm out of here. Another is if the repair itself is less than a month's rent, they can pay it and they can withhold that payment from you. And then the final one, the worst one, is they can sue you in a Texas court and recover all of their losses and their attorney fees and their court costs. So that responsibility to address each of these issues, particularly those that affect the health and safety of an ordinary tenant, are incumbent on you to know they exist. Sometimes you acquire other people's tenants. And you get these tenants because you purchase property and they are already there. And sometimes these tenants are not the best people. They have months of unpaid rent, or they have months of lease violations that a prior management company did not address properly. So you as a new investor want to come in and say, in what way do we want to address the issue of these tenants? And you have multiple options when you're doing that. One might be to begin issuing written notice every single time that tenant violates your lease. Because unless you're doing that, you are waiving your right to relief. Now, you may not know that that's required, and you may not think about it until the problem has gotten so big that you are standing in front of a judge. And maybe it's because they sued you first. And it's not enough for you to say, well, this tenant has been a problem from the beginning. Well, if that's the case, can you prove that you've given written notice of these problems to these tenants? And if you haven't, unfortunately, the court looks at your side of the claim differently than if they have a track record of communication that proves their point more succinctly. Sometimes when you take on property, you take on other people's tenants, and that means other people's problems. But if you get ahead of the game and you know how to respond to each violation of the lease as it occurs in real time, I promise you, you'll lay the foundation for a much better business. Because if you have tenants that are more of a liability than they are an asset, it doesn't work. And your best bet is to remove them from your roles and get people in there who will do better. Sometimes when you acquire property, you take it subject to other people's leases. There's almost nothing worse than acquiring property that's subject to a long-term lease, and that lease isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So get to know the agreements that you are already subject to. Get to know that lease, and as soon as it terminates, replace it. A lot of times investors will come in, or landlords will come in, they'll acquire property that has a lease or that once had a lease. Sometimes it's an oral agreement, which the state of Texas allows, but you do nothing about it. You don't put in a better document that secures you and your rights and the rate of rent that you would prefer. Instead, you stick with the last guy's stuff, which doesn't make you money. Again, just because it was there before you got there doesn't mean it has to stay. If there is a lease that has now lapsed into a month-to-month tenancy, the state of Texas says all you have to do as the new owner, the new investor, is give a 30-day notice of lease termination, at which point you can slip your lease, possibly with a higher rent and better terms, in front of that tenant and says, I love you, I'd love for you to stay, but I want to lock you in on this lease. If you're willing to sign, great, and if not, nice knowing you, it's okay, you can move on, because I'm going to, right? Don't be satisfied with the last guy's written document, because maybe one of the reasons that their stay in charge didn't work was because their paperwork wasn't great. I'll tell you, a bad lease is worse than a bad tenant. If it limits your right and the abilities that you have, particularly to collect money, it doesn't make business sense. And so when you're acquiring property and you're managing property, think of these three things. The fact that when you take on a new property, you sometimes, you're gonna inherit certain basic problems that come with that property. Make sure you're on top of fixing those problems. Second, you're gonna inherit tenants most of the time. You're gonna get other people's tenants and get to know them and get to, again, immediately managing them so that they operate under your philosophy of management. It doesn't have to be the last guy. It doesn't matter if the last guy allowed certain things. You don't have to. And then finally, where the documentation is not in order, make sure you're getting in and you're putting in your contract and you're getting things signed in the way that best suits you and your business.